My name is Drew, and I teach at two high schools in Gangwon, Boys High School and Girls High School. My topic today is going to be on some of the theory behind English education. We spend a lot of time thinking about what we're going to teach, so today let's also think about why. To get us started, I'd like to put a question into your minds, and that is, who owns English? Now, this is a very complicated question, and not even a question that necessarily has a correct answer. But I still think that, as English educators, it is worth thinking about.
Ich glaube, Sie und wir beide wissen, ob Stumm führen. Es ist egal, was mit den anderen Leuten hier in diesem Raum passiert. Wir zwei. Nur.
This is a little boy. I hope you don't mind if I go ask you.
Okay, that was a clip from the Quentin Tarantino movie Inglourious Basterds. Sorry if you couldn't hear it, but I use it here to highlight that there was a time in history when real English was attributed to the King of England. Now, obviously that is quite an outdated idea now, and not least because we don't have a king anymore, we have a queen. And when I was growing up in the UK, I heard the phrase the Queen's English all the time. And I suppose on some level, I was supposed to be trying to achieve her style of English. So does that mean that it's Queen Elizabeth today that speaks real English in the world? Well, possibly, but is the English that she uses any more or less authentic than this man? Does anybody know who this is? No Irish people here? This is Michael Higgins. He's the President of Ireland. Now, obviously, he speaks English too, but not the same way that Queen Elizabeth does. Does anybody know who this is? Any Australians here? This is Malcolm Turnbull. He's the Prime Minister of Australia. Next, we have anyone? Do we have anyone from any countries here today? Well, this is the rather brilliantly named Bill English. He's the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Next, very handsome chap. He is Justin Trudeau. He's the Prime Minister of Canada. How about Jacob Zuma, President of South Africa? Yes. Or perhaps the real champion of modern English is this man.
I'm so sorry.
Now, I think that most people would agree that they all speak real English. But I think most people would also agree that they all speak English differently. Therefore, the idea of real English is simply a matter of attitude. Now, the way that English is collectively valued by everyone involved in its education is ultimately how it's going to be implemented into classrooms. And those attitudes have a habit of trickling down through the years. Now, that's a slightly complicated idea, and that prompted some colleagues and I to create this whirlpool model. So let me talk you through what it symbolizes. So the idea is parents want an education system that's going to prepare their children for employment, and they push the government to deliver this. Governmental policies inform the teachers, and really everything in the outer circle influences the students in the middle. The students then become the next generation of workers, parents, leaders, and educators, and so the whirlpool whirls, and these attitudes go around and around. Traditionally speaking, English has been categorized into English as a native language, English as a second language, and English as a foreign language. Now, this model by Braj is now 25 years old, and over the years, it's been criticized for being more reflective of history and politics rather than linguistic truths. For example, Ireland and South Africa don't feature in any of the circles, when I think most people would probably put them in the inner circle. But even after 25 years, what the model still alludes to is that there are those who speak native English and everybody else who doesn't and is a non-native English speaker. And when it comes to education, we usually only focus on native Englishes. But is the idea of native just another example of history and politics overpowering modern linguistic realities? Well, let's explore that a little bit. So let's go all the way back to the beginning. Old English was a fusion language, nominally influenced by the Saxon invasion into England in the 5th century and the Norman invasion in the 11th century. English's first linguistic conquests came at the expense of Irish and Welsh in around the 15th century. And this was mostly due to the economic balance being on the side of the English. At this point in history, the English being used was very different to what we use today. And it wasn't until around the 16th century that English had evolved into something closer to what we use now. The Protestant Reformation in 1560 sent English Bibles north to Scotland, and this greatly influenced Scottish society as a whole. By the 1922 Anglo-Irish Treaty, English had established itself as the language to speak on both sides of the Irish Sea. But 300 years prior to this, European settlers had colonized the east coast of North America. And by the time President Jefferson negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, the English-speaking settlers had taken control of the continent and were ready to expand west. At this point, Australia had already been a British prison colony for 50 years. And over the next century, the country would be populated with around 162,000 English-speaking convicts. In 1806, Great Britain paid the Netherlands £6 million to officially take control of South Africa. Dutch was quickly banned in an effort to help spread English into the region. In 1840, New Zealand became part of the British Empire at the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. I hope my pronunciation is correct on that one. Okay, so there we have our native English-speaking countries. Let's take a look now at some linguistic realities of the real world. So, in the 17th century, it is estimated there were 7 million total English speakers in the world. One person here represents 1 million. Does anybody know, as of last year, what the population of the UK was? Fair enough. You can cheat and look in your lecture booklets. It's about 63 million people. Does anybody know the population of Ireland? Very good, 4.5 million. A Canadian person? 35 million. Apologies that I made the Canadian person look old. That wasn't intentional. There's about 34 million. Okay, big one. USA. Yeah, it's a little over 300 million people. So lots and lots of people. Australia? Yeah, almost 22 million people. South Africa? 51. And New Zealand? Yeah, kind of New Zealand. Okay, so there we have our native English-speaking countries. Now, if we assume that everyone represented here speaks English, what is the total number of native English speakers in the whole world? Very good. Yeah, it's around 500 million people, which is a lot. So now we think about non-native English speakers. When I was preparing this lecture, I needed a symbol for the world, and I found out we have an Earth flag. Anybody know we have an Earth flag? I use it here. I don't mean to exclude native English speakers from the Earth, but it was the best I could find. Does anyone have any ideas or have read in the lecture booklet how many non-native English speakers there are? I'll tell you. It's estimated there could be a total of 2 billion English speakers in the world. So if we subtract the native English speakers, as we've already discussed, that means there could be as many as 1.5 billion non-native English speakers. So to simplify this, it means that non-native English speakers could now outnumber native speakers by 3 to 1. I had a university professor who never cared how interesting or true something was unless I could answer the question, so what? So what does this mean for us as English educators? Well, firstly, it means that our students are 300% more likely to grow up speaking English to another non-native English speaker. also means that one of English's primary functions on Earth is as a lingua franca. A lingua franca is a second language being used by two or more people who do not share a first language. South Korea does business with almost every country in the world. And if your students do grow up needing English as part of their job, they're very likely to be doing so in an international setting amongst groups with mixed first languages. So these are some of the basic principles that I think make global English research very relevant to us as English educators. Okay, I'm going to be quiet for about 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask you to have a small discussion with the 2 or 3 people sitting around you, and maybe think about what all this could mean for us as native English speakers.
We were talking about correction and when to do it and when not to do it. And I think we discussed that it's okay to let certain mistakes go if it's not, in the classroom or if they do understand each other, because that's sort of the function of language, is to communicate information. So as an English teacher, maybe it's not always good to be a stickler for rules, and sort of keep the student in mind and their pride and sort of their love for the language and not shut them down. Yeah.
Okay, thank you guys.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, before I share some of my thoughts on what it means to be an English teacher, I thought I could touch on what it means to be a native English speaker to begin. So, surely the BBC remains one of the world's greatest exporters of the English language. And last year they published 2 separate articles on how native English speakers need to be more mindful of how we use the language internationally. Let me give you some examples.
The alien mothership is in orbit here. If we can hit that bullseye, the rest of the dominoes will fall like a house of cards. Checkmate.
Okay, that's a clip from Fox's Futurama. I'm going to play that for you one more time.
The alien mothership is in orbit here. If we can hit that bullseye, the rest of the dominoes will fall like a house of cards. Checkmate.
Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone really speaks like Zach Brannigan, but this is an example of how maybe we need to be careful about how we use idioms and slang when we talk to someone who uses a different style of English. Now, I can tell you from experience that advanced English learners really love learning about idioms and slang and other little nuances of English. But I can also tell you from experience that outside of those specific contexts, idioms and slang can often be barriers to communication. In my own life, I was born and raised in the north of England, and I moved to the south of England as a teenager. And that was a really difficult time for me. It was very alienating to find that idioms and slang sometimes don't travel well from city to city, even in the same country. The next thing I'd like to talk about is probably something that I've been guilty of this morning, and that's speaking too fast. Native English speakers speak on average 250 words per minute. Native English speakers are more comfortable at around 150 words per minute. And obviously, depending on the level of your students, you're going to want to speak even slower than that in the classroom. The final thing I'd like to touch on is contractions and abbreviations. When we shorten language, our speech can sound mumbled to someone who isn't used to our style of English. And that's just the beginning. Let me give you the example of I apostrophe D. Sometimes we use I to mean I have in the past tense. Sometimes we use it to mean I would in the future tense. If we can try and use full words and full sentences, we can take the guesswork out of communication, and we can save ourselves from silly misunderstandings. Okay, I apologize if this slide seems a little bit negative. I don't mean it to be. I think that embracing some of these ideas can be really positive for us as teachers. First thing I'd like to say is we can relax. We don't need to be the perfect English speaker, because there is no such thing as a perfect English speaker. A native English teacher's primary job, similar to what you guys were talking about, is to help our students communicate with the language. So my advice would be not to get bogged down in grammar and spelling, and just help your students to make meaning with the language. Another great part of our job is to be cultural ambassadors. Your students are interested in the media that's produced in native English-speaking countries, and you can be their guide to this wealth of information. And finally, we can tell our students about traveling around the world. I imagine that most of you have been to a country where you didn't speak the native language. And I assume by the fact that you're sitting here today that you survived by mostly using English. That's because in the modern world, English is a kind of linguistic passport. So I hope your students to understand how valuable it can be and how widely it is accepted. Okay, I'm going to ask you to take another minute or two in your small groups and think about what this information could mean for non-native English teachers. So, the first thing to say about non-native English speakers is that you are the best example of a modern English user. You represent 75% of all of the world's English speakers. Now, I know that Korean teachers do need to spend a lot of the time preparing the students for exams. And of course, you do need to focus on grammar and spelling to help your students get the best scores. But hopefully you can also find some time to share your experiences. What tips can you give your students to help them learn and use English? How has English helped you as you've traveled to other countries? How do you really use English in the real world? And the final, most important thing to say is to relax. English is used in many, many different ways. And in my opinion, that's what makes English so exciting and dynamic. And exposing our students to as many different styles of English is only going to help them when they use English later in their life. Okay, the final thing I'm going to ask you to discuss quickly is what all of this might mean for students.
Yes, I actually wanted to just mention that sometimes some students, well, English is used almost like a classist thing in Korea, in the sense that students who have families who have more money can get better instruction sometimes and better jobs. So I have come across a lot of students who have an animosity towards English because they feel like, well, my family doesn't have money. I only want to talk to Koreans. I'm not good enough for this. Like, I'm just going to be a farmer. I'm just going to do this. So helping them understand that there's so many different uses and that it can create even more opportunities for them, even in a skill-based, like if they're a carpenter or if they like certain things, even if they have a certain skill set and can use English, it can open them up to more opportunities. They don't have to be working at a company internationally to actually use it or benefit from it. So I think that's really important. It's not just for people who have money.
Right. That's an excellent point, and that was absolutely the first thing I was going to mention. I'd like to tell you about some of the things that I try and do in my English classroom. And the first is to tell my students about this information. I've shown my students parts of this lecture, and some of them just like the bit when the 1,500 global citizens all fly in at once. And that's my favorite bit too, so I don't blame them. But a lot of them are really, well, firstly, really surprised to learn that they're in the majority, not the minority. And secondly, really quite amazed. And I think that it helps them to feel connected to English learners all around the world. Another thing I try and do in my classroom is to encourage my kids to be experimental with their language. Those of you who've taught before will probably know that your best students are not necessarily your smartest students, but often they're your bravest students. So the students that don't panic about making mistakes and just try to make some kind of message with the language skills that they do know. And even with low-level students, I mean, we've probably all heard something like, teacher, me, Englishy, no, and that's not a good sentence. And it's not a pretty sentence, but it is a sentence that does contain a message that we can understand. And my experience is, even with low-level students like that, if you give them gentle but consistent pushes, sometimes they can surprise both of you. The final thing I tell my students to do is to relax. If I can help my students to understand that most English speakers in the world are learners just like them, it makes them feel so much more comfortable to use the language skills that they're learning. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here, and I'm going to ask you one more time. Who owns English? Well, it's still a matter of attitude, so I'll leave your opinion up to you. My personal attitude is that we're all now part of a global community, and English is our most commonly accessible tool. So I think that a little piece of English is owned by everyone who uses it. I also believe that if we can all treat English like it is a shared treasure, then English will become a shared treasure. Thank you very much for listening to me. Has anybody got any questions? You can clap.